All right, we are going to get started. Slowly, gradually, quietly. Okay, I'm just going to use my louder voice. Welcome everybody to the Keynote panel. Welcome especially to those of you who are joining us online. I don't think I have to shout anymore. This level of audio is fine, right? Brilliant. Thank you. My name's Glen Berman. Welcome this morning. I'd like to add my thanks to Uncle Tony. Also like to add, recognise as well as Karina did, that we are on unceded sovereign lands. So lands always will be and always were Aboriginal land. So welcome to the Keynote panel, Infrastructures of Noise. I thought this is one of those themes that does merit a little bit of exposition before we dive in. And so I have just a few observations. Very, very brief. We know that noise is endemic to the communications infrastructure of contemporary life. We experience this every time we engage with social media, the noise of AI slop, of clickbait and rage bait, of misinformation, propaganda and hate, crowding out, even silencing signals of meaningful social interaction and connection. We know also that the distinction between noise and signal is a matter of perspective. AI slop can, after all, also be understood as a signal of an impending AI-prompted breakdown in our collective information and epistemic infrastructure. And finally, we know that the distinction, or the negotiation perhaps, between noise and signal is increasingly mediated by automated decision-making systems. We see this most clearly on social media, where content moderation now relies on automated AI-powered systems for identifying and addressing undesirable content. And crucially, these systems perform again an inversion on our experience of the noise-signal distinction. For their algorithms, it is misinformation and hate that is signal, and meaningful social interaction that is noise. So as our communication infrastructure sits on the threshold of a new paradigm, to be defined by the confluence of platformization, generative AI, and ubiquitous marketization, we want to play this morning with notions of noise and signal. Are the phenomena of misinformation, hallucination, radicalization, and disorder best understood as noise or signal? And how can we think with and through the noise-signal distinction to better understand the shifting status and value of noise, and what kind of problem noise is for the contemporary information and media state? So to lead us in exploring these questions, over the next hour we're joined by four incredible guests. We have Professor Ranjodh Singh Dhaliwal, Dr. Kate Mannell, Dr. Dang Nguyen, Dr. Fabian Offert. Each are going to present a case study, some of them historical, some more contemporary, and we'll move through each presentation, and then we're going to have a good period of time for questions from all of you and also from our friends online, hopefully. So with that, let me introduce our first speaker, Ranjodh Singh Dhaliwal. Ranjodh is a scholar working at the intersections of media theory, science and technology studies, and literary criticism, and is a professor in digital humanities, artificial intelligence, and media studies at the University of Basel. He studies the sociocultural and politico-economic entanglements of our technological worlds, with foci on computing, video games, and infrastructures. Ranjodh co-authored Neural Networks with Théo Lepage-Richer, I'm sorry, I'm sure I butchered that, and Lucy Suchman. And Ranjodh, welcome up.
Thank you so much to the organizers, in advance to my co-panelists, to Glenn, to all of you for being here, to those who are joining online. Let me stop this. How do I, can you help me with? Maybe we can just project this, even if it is, yeah, if you just do full screen on this, we can just minimize the corners. Yeah, this should work, this should work.
It's not coming to now.
Okay, can we drag this?
Oh, that will do it.
Yep.
Sorry, folks.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, this should work. Thank you. That should be good. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. I'm just gonna. Okay. So this is some kind of new work that's drawn from a part of my bigger book project, which essentially traces the political. It performs a political anatomy of computation, and it tries to think about what exactly is computation and how is it distinct from any of the other modalities of technology, of media, of communication, of power and politics. Okay, so I'm going to dive into it. Recently, as I sat there building a new PC from scratch, like a really old millennial whose time has come and gone, I couldn't help but realize how much of my action attended to the thermal management of the machine. I applied a thermal compound from Arctic, installed my graphic card, which came with a fan built by Corsair, and still had to choose the right heatsink for my Cooler Master chassis. Today, if you open a newly built computer, more of your visual field will be occupied by cooling elements than any of the components considered central, quote-unquote, to computation, at least in the technologist's eyes, be that the central processing unit, the memory, or more recently, the graphical processing unit. So what makes the computer so disproportionately thermal as a machine? Again, these are brief remarks. I won't have a chance to go into detail, but essentially in a longer version of this, I argue that computation does not only produce thermal refuse, but that the computation itself is thermal in nature. And so I'm mirroring here the provocation of this Keynote plenary, which is to consider infrastructure as noise instead of the background, instead of signal. The starting point of my inquiry here is thus to understand the thermal signatures of computing not as a side effect, but as a core operational maneuver of informational systems. So this realization historically ties computing to its mechanical and environmental origins and conceptually makes us understand how media as an idea rely on erasing their own ecological traces. In other words, computation is, along with other techniques that I've laid out elsewhere in my work, from addressability to miniaturization, it's also essentially about the production of heat and a managed denial of that production. To put simply, again, if I had more time, I would argue that computers in both their hardware and software forms are curiously thermodynamic and foundationally so, and that has some important takeaways for considering noise, which I'll get to. So the binary zeros and ones that undergird modern digital electronic computing are materially produced. That much is simple and well known. The material production of binary systems needs to be written. This inscription comes about through the act of resistance. Resistance here being the physics resistance, right? In electronic circuits, letting electrons pass produces a 1 or on signal, and not letting them pass produces a 0 or off signal. This interplay of zeros and ones is what makes any binary system function. The act of the resistance here that produces a 0 by negating the possible 1 is also simultaneously the production of heat. At the microscopic level, something is rejected from the system, and this something needs to go somewhere, so it accumulates in the air and becomes heat. Conduction and resistance are thus kind of Derridian doubles that only define each other. Infrastructures of information cannot live without the production of heat, for, as I mentioned, it's not a byproduct, it's also the heart of distinction making. If I had more time, I would walk you through the sort of history of air conditioning and history of labor and its relationship with heat, more specifically race and heat. Specifically, again, we are talking about a kind of noise that only started emerging at a global scale that we understand now from Anthropocenic change. But I don't have the time, so I'll instead give you some kind of juicy anecdotes. One is ENIAC, for those who know, Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, which is one of the kind of first foundational important machines in history of information technologies. A particularly bad case of overheating in October 1946 led to substantial fire damage in the machine, which back then was housed in Moore School's basement in Philadelphia. As a result of this fire, was moved to the Ballistics Research Laboratory in Aberdeen, Maryland, where a specially designed hall included an air conditioning unit that could dissipate the heat from its 18,000 vacuum tubes. For digital computers, for electronic computers, this was the first time you actually have heat management happening in the surroundings. More notably, I think in this case it's worth pondering the fact that ENIAC would also then soon become the site and the machine for running the world's first weather simulations. So this is where actually we start getting, for the first time, an understanding of climate as a phenomena, precisely because of this really hot machine that was prone to breaking down. So this new era of weather forecasting, run on one of the world's first actual electronic computers in March of 1950, during the summer, unsurprisingly, actually meant that most of the humans who were working on ENIAC started putting their desks inside ENIAC. So they were sort of like spending their work days inside the computer, which was the air-conditioned building that it was, it was the size of the building. So they were sheltered from summer heat and humidity. So I just want to kind of suggest that firstly, the vacuum tube's very function here, the earliest versions required a heated filament for their conduction, was predicated upon the production of heat. Secondly, that this production needed to be diffused and as a result necessitated the design of newer air-conditioned spaces for computers. And thirdly, the case of an overheating computers that eventually runs the world's first weather simulations is a sort of a myth that should go alongside Borges's map, right? This is one of the first electronic digital computers, a machine, on the one hand studying the overheating of the world, and on the other hand is an overheated world itself that is overheating the world. As simulation turning on and into its own origins, both the weather simulations and the computer simulations in this case, I think the kind of anecdote offers an instructive case for what happens when heat is considered to be both necessary and undesired, kind of paradoxically. Again, I wouldn't go far into detail with any of the other stuff, talking about how metrics are understood when it comes to thermal power, and so on and so forth, or what the history of air conditioning looks like. But I will tell you this, that at the level of hardware, another tale from 1980 may prove instructive. It's famously said that Apple III was doomed to fail because Steve Jobs wanted it to have no fans. So Steve Jobs famously hated noise and airflows produced by fans or fan-like components. So he wanted and really got an Apple III that had no fans. The problem was that it would stop working. And as you see on the screen, these problems started affecting not just other people, where the screen data would be garbled or the parts of the computer were even melted. Even Apple's own employees started having these problems, and they started slamming it down on desk out of frustration, right? Which is when, in subsequent manuals, they actually started putting as advice that if your computer starts producing garbled data, why don't you pick it up and throw it down, right? I like to think that that's where one of the finest poets of our generation, Snoop Dogg, got the idea of dropping it like it's hot. But that's hearsay. Okay. But one could argue that, well, all machines produce heat. What's specific about informational systems? What are we talking about here that's actually kind of signal and noise in modern communication? And for that, again, if I had the time, I would go more specifically into the thermodynamic origins of information sciences. Specifically, that what we are talking about here is that all information understood in communication theory is fundamentally thermodynamic, and as a result, computational specificity is involved not just in producing machines like all the other industrial assemblages, but it's involved in the thermal conversion of the planet's mechanics into conceptual infrastructures. This specific case of informational signals and noise is about the rendering symbolic of the mechanical. And it's this that is specific to computers and information systems. Again, I'm not going to go into detail, but I will briefly leave you with an example of the Perlin noise. Again, this needs to go back into the history of computer graphics and whatnot. But what I want to note here is that in this particular technique of noising, the mechanical noise, the entropy of real-life models and objects used in studios, was being replaced by a software trick. So what was happening is essentially that you were superimposing noise onto computer-generated imagery to make it look real. Because real-life things aren't clean and shiny and perfect. So to make them feel real, you were generating random noises and superimposing on it. And that's where kind of Perlin noise comes from. It actually gets Ken Perlin, its inventor, an Academy Award for Technical Achievement in 1990. But essentially what's happening here is that informational noise is actually representing a real physical object in sort of games and in visual culture and in cinema. So it has been used by Hollywood effects since then. It's still widely used. They all make use of software shaders. Software shaders all depend heavily on noise, including Perlin noise. For me, this is a specific story of entropy, software entropy standing in for hardware entropy. The same informational techniques that make computation, at least somewhat distinct from all the other industrial machinery, are nevertheless materially and thermally situated here, just like gears and wires are, that are commonly a part of the industrial built imaginaries. So I want to leave us with three primary takeaways in regards to the provocation on the table that's put by the organizers. Firstly, and I'm looking forward to hearing from my co-panelists about this, but the fact that infrastructures are noisy means that there's always a foregrounding that can happen of the noise. And that foregrounding leads you down specific kinds of methodological directions that you wouldn't get to if noise was considered outside of the system, something always to be expelled. So cannot be expelled from within inquiry, within academic inquiry itself. Secondly, that basically means that noise is as important as signal. It's a perspectival problem, and to not understand it as important as signal is to only sort of defer the question of noise into the future, as we did with the question of the atmospheric noise that was all the heat accumulating in the world. And finally, the difficulty for me lies in the transitions, the conversions between signal and noise. When one becomes the other for any group, any part of individuals or societies or technologies more generally, whether it's humans or non-humans, when do we start considering noise as signal and signal as noise? When does one become the other? I think is the sort of key linchpin between trying to understand infrastructures as noise and infrastructures of noise. Thank you.
I feel like it's inevitable that this laptop is going to overheat now.
Recording in progress.
Okay. Our second speaker is Dr. Dang Nguyen. Dang is a researcher of digital economies, information infrastructures, and platform governance, with a particular focus on Southeast Asia. She's a research fellow at the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making in Society at RMIT. Her work draws together ethnography, media theory, and infrastructure studies to interrogate how technologies shape and are shaped by everyday life. She's the author of Digital Research, Methods and the Diaspora, and Internet Cures. Please welcome Dang.
Thanks, Glenn, for that introduction. It's so unfair to have to follow Ranjodh, but someone's got to do it. So when Chris O'Neill invited me to speak here today, I read it less as an invitation and more as a dare. A dare to be exactly as weird as I can in the next few minutes. If you know Chris at all, you'll know what I mean. He's pretty weird himself in the best possible way. So this is me stepping into that there. And so I'm going to talk about loudspeakers in 2 acts. I wrote 3, but we don't have all day. So we'll have brief intermissions, but no toilet breaks. And then we'll see where that takes us. So here you go, Chris. Now, our story today starts with the gramophone, which is to say it starts with memory. A gramophone is a ritual object awaiting activation. It both plays and records sound. And because sound is already memory, the gramophone is ghostly. A gramophone is a solitary ear. It is quiet, poised, remembering, listening. It archives the sound that was once shared. It hones the chord. Here, it seems to have said something rude to Bill Murray, but perhaps it was only repeating what it was once told. The gramophone doesn't mind a crowd. Here we see Albert Sarraut, freshly appointed Governor General of French Indochina, staged in a Hmong hamlet on the Laotian bank of the Mekong River. 2 garrison officers frame 6 villagers and a lone child. A local catechist, perhaps the recruiter of this audience, looks straight into the lens, while another official hovers over Sarraut's shoulder. The photograph ran in L'Illustration, Paris's glossy imperial weekly, alongside Among the People and Sights of Laos. The article cast these highlands as terra promissa, ripe for new transport links, future markets, untapped resources. After noting local dances and bullfights, the writer lingers on Sarraut's party trick. He draws a portable disc phonograph from his luggage and plays Franz Lehar's La Veuve Joyeuse. Mechanized melody stands in for missing cathedrals, railways, boulevards. Here, technological spectacle does the work of masonry. It orders bodies, carves hierarchy, phones the hamlet into imperial time. The newest listeners to the colonial message join the empire not by oath or by flag, but by ear. If the gramophone was a solitary ear, the radio made listening communal. With the radio in the home, listening is no longer a ritual of one. It became a choreography of many. With this, a new kind of silence entered the home, shared, expectant, shaped by sound that traveled without invitation. This Radio Times cover from 1923 captures the shift. The radio set itself is invisible, but its power is palpable. A disembodied voice steals the room. Nobody speaks, but everyone listens and looks intensely at us. Radio folded the outside world into domestic life. Music, war, comedy, news, all delivered through a machine that neither looked back nor waited for reply. This wasn't just entertainment. It was training. Training in posture, in attention, in how to be modern together. The gramophone whispered in private, but the radio commanded the room. Here is a scene from the 1920s. A family gathered around a homemade radio set, complete with exposed vacuum tubes, coiled wires, tuning dials, and a large flared horn speaker. The contraption looks more like a laboratory experiment than a domestic appliance, its guts laid bare on the living room table. This was not yet a sleek consumer object. It was raw, electrical, tactile. The caption calls it a portal into other places from your own house, and that's exactly the feeling. It wasn't just a machine, it was an opening. What's striking is, I think, the intimacy here. No grand architecture, no colonial theater, just a floral curtain, a cabinet of china, and shared anticipation. One woman wears headphones, completely absorbed. The man in the corner smokes his pipe as if weighing the gravity of what they're receiving. Radio brought the world into the domestic interior, but it did something more subtle, too. It restructured the sensory economy of the home. It created new rituals, gathering, listening, imagining, and new rhythms for everyday life. Meal times shifted, silences thickened, authority was rebalanced. You couldn't see what you heard, so your body had to lean in, to trust, to fill in the gaps. Where the gramophone was a performance, a demonstration of mastery, often for the benefit of others, radio became something more private, more durational. It was dwelled in. It made modernity audible, but it also made it felt. Next up, we have the Ampliant Dragon, model AR114, which is an oak horn loudspeaker from around 1924. It's not just a piece of audio equipment, it's an aesthetic object. It's curved, sculptural, almost floral in form. Notice the contrast with the exposed circuitry of the earlier image. So here, sound is no longer raw or precarious. It is refined, it's housed in elegance. There was a time when radio were becoming furniture, when listening was not only about hearing, but also about dwelling in beauty. But hold on to this elegance, because soon we'll encounter a different kind of loudspeaker, one that doesn't ask to be admired. So let's take a breath and see what we've seen so far. One, we've seen loudspeakers as hauntology, how sound technologies linger with the afterlife of empire. Two, we've glimpsed at loudspeakers in the home, domestic, intimate, interior. Three, we've witnessed loudspeakers as an aesthetic object, crafted, refined, exquisite. Each of these opens onto a different world, the spectral, the private, the ornamental. But stay with me, because things are about to get louder, messier, and more urgent. So far, we've stayed within the realm of the intimate, the ornamental, the spectral, but let's turn up the volume. Few sounds are more brutal than those of war. Not just gunfire or bombs, but the loudspeakers designed to unnerve, to confuse, to haunt. Loudspeakers are usually imagined as tools of connection, music, speech, broadcast. But in wartime, they turn. Sound becomes a tactic. Volume becomes violence. Nowhere is this more unsettling or more enduring than in the wartime loudspeakers of Vietnam. When the Geneva Accords of 1954 split Vietnam at the 17th parallel, both sides raced to colonize the air. Networks of wired horns and mass-mounted loudspeakers sprang up along the DMZ, their mouths angled across the Ben Hai River like artillery. From the northern bank came hymns to socialism, paeans to revolutionary sacrifice, denunciations of imperialist lackeys. From the south came counter-broadcasts extolling democracy, warning of communist deprivation. The line on the map became a thick oral band, a daily melee of slogans, marches, and distorted applause that could last 15 hours as a stretch. Wind carried the clash of timbers deep into neighboring provinces, so even those far from the front line awoke inside its echo. The campaign was mobile as well as loud. In 1955, the Vinland Broadcasting Station outfitted ox-drawn carts with 180-watt horns, trundling them up and down the river's 10-kilometer corridor to skirt artillery range and keep the pressure constant. Each cart redrew the frontier in sound, turning territory into radius. By 1965, the acoustic duel was drowned out by something heavier: jets, artillery, and the long roar of carpet bombing. Yet the logic of the loudspeaker, occupy the ear, rewrite the border inside the mind, survived the shift from amplified voice to explosive thunder. In a war where silence could summon existential dread, controlling what could and could not be heard was itself a form of power. Peace and quiet was never an option in times of war. The terror of silence lies in its absence of life. Ear witnesses of sonic warfare lived in an overdense soundscape. Bomb blasts, airstrikes, rumbling tanks, droning helicopters, sirens, crosstalk, radio static, propaganda broadcasts. In such an unfavorable signal-to-noise environment, perspective is often lost. Everything affects everything all the time, blending foreground into background. There was no distance, only the immediacy of now. That's war. Such a composition demands conscious listening as well as cultivated insouciance, because our sense of hearing cannot be closed off at will, techniques of non-listening had to be developed to attune us to subtle cues of change in the environment. By the time that the Republic of Vietnam, or South Vietnam, President Nguyen Van Minh delivered his surrender statement to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, or North Vietnam, on live radio on April 30th, 1975, so exactly 50 years ago, technologies of sound broadcast have solidified themselves as a stable framework through which social order is maintained over time. So in other words, they have acquired infrastructural qualities. But how did people live with all that noise? During wartime, yes, but also beyond it. Now, Vietnamese cities are famously loud. Go to Saigon or Hanoi, and what hits you isn't just sound, but a sort of sensory assault. The roar of traffic, the layered voices, the smell of fish sauce and exhaust, the thickness of the air. Your whole body is taken hostage. How did people come to inhabit this atmosphere? Not just to endure it, but to make life inside it. What kind of attunement, what kind of bodily literacy allows one to dwell in this excess without collapse? That's a larger question than I can fully unpack here, but I'll leave you with this compressed lineage. So over the course of the French colonial period and through successive conflicts, techniques of listening and deliberate non-listening evolved in Vietnam not just as habits of survival, but as a deep-seated kind of disposition. What emerges is a kind of media unconscious, a learned attunement forged in noise that helps explain what from the outside might seem like an impossibly high tolerance for sonic intrusion among Vietnamese residents of today. In colonial Vietnam, radio arrived piecemeal and privately. The French refused to bankroll empire-wide broadcasting, so commercial stations and hobbyist clubs built transmitters by piggybacking on the telegraph network. Sets were rare and costly, yet owners displayed them near windows and cranked the volume, turning alleyways and village greens into open-air listening rooms. This communal sound culture trained audiences into a double art, tuning in when the music or the theater or the football commentary mattered, and mentally tuning out when it did not. By the 1940s, Vichy Governor Jean Decoux recognized radio's propagandistic power, so the Viet Minh soon did the same. This is where our story kind of comes full circle. After the 1954 Geneva Accord split the country at the 17th parallel, both sides weaponized the collective ear. Wide horn networks along the DMZ hurled anthems, slogans, and threats across the Ben Hai River for up to 15 hours a day. What began as a convivial neighborhood listening habit had hardened into an acoustic arms race, and the habit of selective hearing, the media unconscious, forged in colonial cafes and courtyard gatherings, became a survival skill on the new sonic frontline. So in Act number 2, we have the following. 1, if Act 1 gave us loudspeakers as hauntology, spectral, archival, poised, then here we saw them in wartime, saturating space, blaring ideology, marking territory through sheer sonic force. 2, if the home once folded the outside world inward, we now saw how loudspeakers turned the domestic sound outward, shared, overheard, collectively endured. 3, and where once we saw aesthetic refinement, now we met a different kind of aesthetic, not crafted and exquisite, but infrastructural, durable, obtrusive, everywhere. A loudspeaker not to be admired, but to be endured. Each of these extends the world we glimpsed earlier, now louder, rougher, and closer to the skin. So if in Act 1 we saw the loudspeaker as object, refined, ornamental, then in Act 2 we met the loudspeaker as environment. Messy, loud, shared, endured. This takes us to something deeper. Because when a loudspeaker stops asking to be seen or to be admired, when it simply is, part of the air, part of the day, that it has become something else entirely. It has become infrastructure. As Brian Larkin reminds us, infrastructures are not just technologies, they're what other things rely on. They structure life not through novelty, but through repetition, through default, through the assumption of presence. And the loudspeaker in Vietnam is exactly that kind of object. It doesn't just carry messages, it conditions the field in which listening happens. So if we follow the loudspeaker all the way through, From ontology to domestic ritual, from aesthetic object to infrastructural presence, what we encounter is not just a device, but a system. Loudspeakers don't just project sound, they shape environments. They blur the boundary between signal and noise, and in doing so, they train us quietly, persistently, in how to listen, how to filter, how to feel. And this is where residual media do their most powerful work, because what seems outmoded, teeny, analog, obsolete, can still structure life. Residual media endure not as nostalgic traces, but as active infrastructures, shaping subjectivity, organizing space, sedimenting relations. When a loudspeaker becomes background, when it's just part of the atmosphere, that's when its effects are most deeply felt. And as Larkin reminds us, infrastructures are not just technologies, they're conditions of possibility. They create the grounds upon which other systems, other meanings come into being. So maybe the loudspeaker is not just a holdover from a noisier time. Maybe it is the noise that keeps time, folding signal and silence into a world we've learned to live inside. And with that, Chris, I hope I've been weird enough. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it was particularly fitting that you drew from Poetics of Infrastructure, because that was such a poetic exposition of such a vital infrastructural system. So thank you. Let me... Okay. Our third panellist, Dr. Kate Mannell. Kate's work analyses the design, governance and use of digital technologies with a focus on their role in the everyday lives of families and young people. Kate is a research fellow at the ARC Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child located at Deakin University. Kate's current projects focus on the platformisation of family life and the discourse around children's screen time. Kate's research has been covered in The Atlantic, The Guardian, the ABC and The Conversation. Please join me in welcoming Kate.
Thank you, Glenn, for the lovely introduction. Glenn has done a wonderful job of kind of wrangling this panel into a structure, because we're going to continue to both zoom forward in time, but also I think zoom in scale into some kind of messiness of everyday life. My work looks at how we live with digital technologies in everyday life, and on reflection, actually, a lot of that work has been about a kind of problem of noise. For a long time, as we've talked about, obviously the challenge of communication technology was a challenge of sending and receiving a signal, but we became kind of very good at that, maybe too good at that, and now the challenge of living with communication technology has become a real challenge of managing noise. Some of my early work, including my PhD, was looking at how people manage that problem through different kinds of practices of kind of disconnection or resistance. How do people pull back or put boundaries around technology use or mediated interactions when they become kind of too noisy? So today I'm going to offer a kind of variation on that theme. These are some emerging, very half-formed thoughts about the very noisy landscape of social media advice that parents, particularly mothers, often have to navigate. This is an idea that came up, as ideas often do, in the context of researching something else. For the past 18 months, I've been doing a project which is looking about how we talk about very young children and screen use. So interested in the kind of public and everyday discourses around that topic. The interesting thing about those discourses is that they're very stuck in this kind of very emotive, very rigid, very kind of alarmist space that's proven very difficult to shift. And so I've been very interested in the question of like, why? Why is it that our conversations around that topic look the way that they do? I've done a bunch of things to grapple with that question, and the things that are of most relevance to what I'm going to talk about today is that I spend a lot of time looking at social media parenting advice content, and also did some work interviewing parents including asking them about their kind of experiences with those discourses. One of the things that became really apparent is that in this area, as in many other kinds of topics around child raising, parents are faced with this wealth of kind of conflicting, very alarmist advice that they have to kind of sort into signal and noise. If you're not in this world of kind of early years parenting, you might very reasonably assume that, you know, humans have been raising children for a long time. Surely there's some fairly clear and consistent advice around the basics, but I can tell you that is not the case. Feeding, sleeping, toilet training, behaviour management, even really minute things, how to praise a child, are subject to huge volumes of very loud, often quite emotive, and typically very conflicting advice. Of course, there's always been a kind of range of ideas and approaches about how to raise children, but the level of noise in contemporary online parenting advice feels distinct. If we look at histories of parenting advice, they do kind of point to a rise and fall of different approaches. You have new schools of thought that come through, usually pushing back on whatever came before. These different schools of thought are generally exemplified by kind of one or two figures who really dominate the landscape because they write books that are very, very widely read. But then with digital media and particularly social media, you have this real democratization of being a parenting expert that then gets accelerated through some particular features that I'm going to talk to in a second. It's very hard to convey what this kind of landscape of online parenting advice is like if you're not kind of subject to it. So to try to give you a brief sense of it, I'm going to actually tell you about an Instagram reel where a woman parodies this content. So the title of the video is My Social Media Feeds Since Becoming a Parent. And in this video, this woman acts out the kind of opening seconds of a sequence of parenting advice videos, one after the other, in this very kind of urgent and judgmental tone. She starts, "If your 2-month-old isn't crawling yet, try these 6 exercises with them. 8 tips for swaddling your newborn from a certified swaddle specialist. I'm an infant neurologist and I would never swaddle my baby. Here's why. 13 enrichment activities to do with your newborn in their next 20-minute wake window. Here's an AI-generated picture of a baby with a ridiculously flat head. This will be your child if you don't do more tummy time. Buy these diapers and your baby will sleep through the night. If you don't send your baby to daycare, they'll be socially awkward for the rest of their lives. This is why you should never send your baby to daycare. I prevented an ugly bald spot from forming on the back of my infant's head by using this product. Comment aesthetic baby on this reel and I'll send you the link." She continues in this manner for like a full minute, and while some of the examples are kind of absurd, it's actually more accurate to the experience of being subject to this content than you might think. We've got conflicting advice, we've got emotive advice, it's very hyperbolic, everything is urgent, everything is high stakes, buying stuff will solve your problems, and there's a really wide range of experts who are kind of claiming to know best. This idea that your social media feeds turn into this very noisy landscape of advice when you become a parent also came up in my conversations with parents when I was interviewing them. As one mother said to me, you know, on my Instagram feed now, I'm getting like pediatric occupational therapists and physios recommending that you need to do XYZ activity to help your baby roll by 4 months and you have to do X amount of tummy time. She continued talking about how this wasn't really advice that she necessarily wanted. For example, all the pediatric OTs that keep coming up in my feed saying, you have to do this to develop the baby's abdominal muscles, or like whatever, where is this even coming from? There were 2 very kind of common themes in parents' accounts about this experience. One was a sense that this advice content was kind of impossible to avoid, and a second that it was very overwhelming, both in its volume and in its very like conflicting nature. Both of these are raised by another mum who I spoke with who said, on social media, once you become a parent, you just can't avoid it, meaning like this barrage of advice content. It's like, when did this happen and when will it go away? And it doesn't. It's like a big black hole. You could get disappeared, like lost in all the parenting advice online. This feeling of overwhelm was reiterated by a new mum of a 6-month-old who was particularly frustrated about this experience, saying, there's too much shit. And you start thinking, oh my God, my baby is developmentally just not on point. it's like, here's this tip for sleep. And I'm like, oh, you know, I don't need another tip for sleep. His sleep is just shit. I've tried everything. I don't want another tip. Part of what's going on here is around kind of cultural constructions of parenting, an ever-rising bar of what's required in order to be a good parent according to kind of Anglo middle-class norms. But for the purposes of this panel and this conversation, I want to say less about the parenting-specific elements of this and more about what we could maybe characterize as a broader infrastructure of noise, the structures that are sitting behind this kind of foghorn of social media advice content. So what might some of those features be? I think this is partly about the rise of a particular kind of informational address on social media, a kind of informational genre, which we can probably trace to the influence of TikTok, short-form video content, the need to have something to say, this kind of model of virality that's more around posts than accounts now. I think this is also partly about not just content creation as a profession, but also specifically as a side hustle among professionals who have another career. So a lot of parenting advice content, as you will have seen, is from speech therapists, pediatricians, health professionals. A lot of it's also from kind of self-styled professionals, so brain trainers or parenting coaches, people who have another job but do content creation on the side and speak from this kind of expert persona. And lastly, and maybe most significantly, I think this has a lot to do with a shift on social media platforms to very heavily prioritizing content that you don't follow and that you haven't searched for. So this is obviously the premise of TikTok, but it's become a very strong feature of all the platforms. So Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, they all now have a real emphasis on trying to get a user into a kind of TikTok-style scrollable feed of short video content that is algorithmically recommended as opposed to being from accounts that you follow. And this means that, as a lot of the parents that I spoke with noted, it doesn't really matter how you control what you follow. That doesn't shut off the flow of this kind of recommended advice content. So you have these things kind of combining with a particular moment in parenting culture to create this real like fire hose of unsolicited advice. Some of the parents that I spoke with talked about the kind of benefits of this, exposure to a lot of ideas, the ability to pick and choose, but mostly they talked about it as a very unwanted, uninvited kind of static that was at worst disempowering and anxiety-provoking, and at best kind of annoying and disruptive to the enjoyment of social media. And the very last thing that I'll just quickly say is that I think it's interesting to think about this in the context of the shift to generative AI and the use of those platforms for advice. Using them for parenting advice is quite a common kind of use. And I think we can see part of the appeal of platforms that promise to kind of give advice with less noise, to cut out the labor-intensive process of scanning, synthesizing diverse and conflicting advice, and giving you something that you know promises to be more signal and less noise, I guess. Thank you.
There we go. All right. So, thank you, Kate. I have a newborn and the sleep advice is like, I was emailing last night about it. It's just like, it's so overwhelming. Last speaker, Dr. Fabian Offert. Fabian studies the epistemology, aesthetics, and politics of artificial intelligence and is assistant professor for the history and theory of the digital humanities and director of the Center for the Humanities and Machine Learning at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Fabian's current book project, Vector Media, investigates how AI models represent culture and what is at stake when they do. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Glenn, for the introduction and for allowing me to be here and to be part of this fantastic panel. I really like this format. Nobody needs to hear anybody speak for longer than 10 minutes, I think. So that's really, that's the way to go. All right, noise is dead. In this space and in any other space, this is obviously a provocation, so let me explain. Noise, for many artists, activists, and academics alike, is linked to an aesthetics of subversion. As Eric Salvaggio writes, quote, artists are the buzz in the radio, the data that brings AI to a glitching halt. Instead of seeing noise as something to block out, artists, in this exhibition here right next door, reframe noise as a signal in itself, an opportunity for creative engagement. Or as media scholar Violaine Boutet de Monvel argues, quote, an artist strives to magnify the noise within and via any given medium, as opposed to the engineer who seeks to suppress it. In saying that noise is dead, just like punk is, I'm thus saying noise has been recuperated on a deep technical and epistemic level. So perhaps, this is my suggestion, we need to reconsider this particular binary that positions noise as an aesthetic antidote to a perceived signal hegemony. More precisely, I would like to argue that dominant technical systems, AI systems first and foremost, now aim to and sometimes actually manage to exploit the assumed potential of noise to harbor alternative ways of thinking the world. To understand why, we have to look at how these systems operate not on the level of the interface, but further down the stack. And to do so, I would suggest that we go back to February of 2023. In February 2023, the large language model ChatGPT, some of you might have seen that before, made it into the New Yorker and into the writing of one of the most prominent contemporary science fiction authors, Ted Chiang. The title metaphor of Chiang's article would have been fundamentally incomprehensible to a reader 30 years ago. He writes, ChatGPT is a blurry JPEG of the web. In other words, ChatGPT retains much of the information on the web in the same way that a JPEG image file retains much of the information of a higher resolution image. But if you're looking for an exact sequence of bits, exact pieces of information, you won't find it. All you ever get is an approximation. At the center of Chiang's argument is the fact that large language models tend to hallucinate. They occasionally produce text that sounds factual, but whose truth status is entirely coincidental. Hallucinations, Chiang says, are compression artifacts. The model has to interpolate from incomplete, from lossy information. And it's this interpolation that gives the impression of comprehension. As he writes, when we're dealing with sequences of words, lossy compression looks smarter than lossless compression. Lossy compression in ChatGPT and similar models, then, does not only fulfill a pragmatic function to store a smaller version of the web, but also an ideological one. We are impressed by ChatGPT because we read its lossy compression as lossless. Unfortunately, again, this is my suggestion here, Chiang's analogy is a rather unhelpful near miss. AI systems, including ChatGPT, are compression systems, but of a fundamentally different kind than the sorts of compression systems we are used to dealing with, both epistemologically and ideologically. Now, traditionally, computer scientists distinguish between two kinds of compression. Information which has been compressed losslessly can be reconstructed in full. If you put files from your computer into a zip archive, you can, at least in theory, always get back the full versions. This is done by reducing redundancy at a statistical level, often by spotting identical sequences that repeat. The aim of lossy compression, on the other hand, and the example here is the entire movie Shrek compressed into a 20 megabyte GIF file that's running here in the background. The aim of lossy compression, on the other hand, is to produce an approximation of the original signal by exploiting our own perceptual inattention to certain kinds of information. Lossy compression algorithms, like this one here, are therefore more interesting ideologically, as by deciding what to keep and what to discard, they each contain a kind of immanent value theory of a particular medium. It's here, or so goes the popular argument, that also bias enters the pipeline. But AI systems, I think, cannot be identified with either of these prior forms of computational compression, because they are explicitly designed to hold and process information beyond what is necessary for reconstruction. And to do so, they fundamentally rely on the strategic recuperation of noise. But again, not in a traditional sense. I'm not referring here, for instance, to the kind of noise that plays a role in generative systems like Stable Diffusion that learns to reconstruct images from Gaussian noise, but in the epistemic sense. Noise in today's neural compression systems becomes a carrier of knowledge. Noise in that sense becomes signal. How so? You have to bear with me here for a moment while I briefly explain one of the fundamental techniques of contemporary AI systems. A technique so fundamental that I would argue that it could be regarded as the ideological core of artificial intelligence. I'm talking here about the technique of embedding. Embedding, very briefly, means to find a representation for a data set with the help of machine learning that not only allows us to reconstruct most of the data set, but that allows us to reason over this data set by understanding it as a space in which each word, each image, each sound, and so on corresponds to a continuous, that is, to a floating point, high-dimensional vector. This approach is not new. Embedding, in a sense, has been around at least since the 1970s, but it became a hegemonic paradigm only in the early 2010s, when it became apparent that it could be used to solve so-called analogical reasoning tasks. The textbook example here of such a task is the analogy man is to king as woman is to what? Now, the answer for everybody with half a brain is easily inferred, it's queen, but until very recently this was a very hard computational problem. And the solution for machine learning people lies in an embedding of these concepts, in rephrasing them arithmetically and geometrically. King minus man plus woman equals queen in the parallelogram that you can produce in this embedding space. Now, this is, of course, always, again, an ideological move, and thus this particular example of a so-called word embedding model also marks the beginning of research on bias in machine learning. But the rightful accusation of bias, that bias attaches to the meaning of the geometric analogy, not to the fact that a geometric analogy is understood to produce meaning in the first place. A similar arithmetic of meaning can be implemented in the visual domain as well. The embedding space compresses both textual and visual culture, which gets us eventually to the multimodals of today, which can process both text and images and many other media forms. But importantly, and in a strange post-structural twist, for both images and text, the value here lies in the gaps between the representations, not in the representations themselves. All the knowledge, quote unquote, of contemporary AI systems, as limited as it is, lives here, in the gaps between the representations. And these gaps come into existence only because of the particular technical approach to representation that embedding provides. They simply do not and cannot exist in traditional forms of compression. And it's through these gaps that embeddings move beyond reconstruction. It's here that noise becomes signal, where ground suddenly obtains value. But this fundamentally epistemic ambition of embedding and of machine learning in general has one important consequence. Embeddings and the technique of embedding estranges cultural artifacts from their media forms. A digital image remains an image in the sense that the relationship between sensory information and pixel information is relatively deterministic. I'm talking about the JPEG from before. This is absolutely not the case for embedded images, which represent this sensory information in an exclusively relational fashion. An image embedding is meaningless except in its position amongst the set of all other images which a model has ingested. Today, then, we are witnessing the emergence of a new form of equivalence in the cultural sphere, one that goes well beyond the simple digitization or commodification, as for instance described in Adorno and Horkheimer's account of the culture industry. And I would like to refer to the kind of commensurability imposed by embeddings and similar techniques as neural exchange value. Media objects were, of course, already commodities long before neural networks and machine learning and artificial intelligence, but only in terms of market exchange. Now they are also commodities in terms of neural exchange, a neural exchange based on the recuperation of noise. And it's here where the idea of noise as a refuge of human creativity, aesthetic ambiguity, or artistic autonomy dies. Because contemporary AI systems, contemporary AI has never been about getting rid of noise. It is indeed about the recuperation of noise. Embedding quite literally is noisy capitalism, or rather noise turned into a medium of exchange. It's capitalism that has moved away from classification and instead has started to embrace a noisy, ambiguous relationality as its guiding principle. Noise, thus, is dead, and Silicon Valley has killed it. Thank you.
We might all yeah, please. Panelists come up and
then it's retire as well. So,
All right.
we're going to send it.
All right. We might come back.
Wait, stay by.
All right. Tim's pointing out to me that this was a mistake. He's wrong. I'm sure all of you can use your techniques of listening to both listen now in. And we'll come back.
What's that? I said it, but
Thank you.
yeah, it's serious.
Thank you.
No,
I'm going to start.
that.
To begin our discussion, I'm going to invite each of our panelists to ask a question of somebody else on the panel. And we're then going to open it up to people in the audience. And so maybe we'll move from closest to most distant from me. So I'll start over here.
Yeah, cool. Thanks to all of you for follow up to this fantastic. And I have so many questions. I want to ask you, Ranjodh, though, because this don't way we thought. Right? I want to ask you about the relationship between heat from the infrastructural angle and heat from the computational angle. And I want to ask you, where do you see the two interfacing precisely? Because you could, if you want to be a little bit antagonistic, right? Or if I would want to be a little bit antagonistic, I could say, well, if we understand information from the thermodynamic angle, it ceases to be information, right? Because the symbolicness of it is simply our interpretation of it. So does that mean if we want to think both things together, if we want to think the infrastructure of cooling and heating and the thermodynamic aspect of computation, does that mean that we have to disregard everything that's symbolic about computation? Does it result in there is no software, a dictum that we already have, in a sense?
Yeah, but the fact that we are asking that question is, I think, for me, the distinction, right? So basically I agree with you. In fact, I'll take that antagonism further and be like, okay, not only is it the case that the thermodynamic noise generates the symbolic, the realm of the symbolic, but also it is the case that the computational specificity here, vis-a-vis the infrastructural heat more generally, the infrastructural noise more generally, lies in forgetting. It's a memory problem, lies in forgetting the first order of operations of materiality. It's actually not distinct in any meaningful way, except in a socially cultural way where we actually only imbue it with the symbolic, and that necessitates a refusal of the material. And it's that refusal, I think, that would form the fine distinction that you're asking between heat from kind of computational sense and from the infrastructural sense. That answers there.
Yeah, I had so many things to say to Kate.
It sounds like a threat.
Yes. Threat or an invitation.
Yeah, well, I've got a flat head, so like what you said there just goes straight into my deepest insecurity. So that's the first thing. Need to call my mom after this. She did something wrong there. But I guess I was really struck by the absolute psychosis that seems to accompany the parenting experience. So as a non-parent, I don't get it.
Could you speak to that based on the many parents you've talked to? Because where does that worry? Why do they surround themselves with so much noise? Why do they respond to this noisy infrastructure of the parenting world? Where when intuitively you could just tune out, told you, but there is an impulse there to not tune out because you want to do the right thing. And I can't help you with the flat head, so we'll take it out for now. But I think the kind of question that you're asking is like, what's the driver to like listen to the noise? Why tune in? Why not just kind of tune out? And I guess to like position myself here, I'm also not a parent, so I can be fascinated with the challenge of it without having to be subject to it. So speaking from not personal experience, but from having spent a lot of time with parents, talking with parents, and kind of thinking and reading about it, I think it comes from not knowing. You don't know what you're doing, and so you need advice, right? And I think that partly speaks to the kind of contemporary format of the family. You haven't grown up raising children. You're probably not from typically you're not from a large family. You haven't grown up raising children in a way that maybe you would have in a different time and place. And so you come to parenting with no really idea about what you're doing, and so you need advice. But then the places where you can go for advice are also kind of limited and structured in particular ways. And there is also this thing happening around the value of different kinds of expertise, and the idea that to be a good parent is to be kind of scientifically informed. So you need to go and learn from the right kinds of scientific knowledge in order to understand, the latest evidence-based kind of practice. And so you have to go to these particular sources of information. But then the labor of doing that becomes immense. So there is some other great empirical work where people have looked at the way that mothers in particular are called on to survey, select, synthesize, and then enact certain forms of knowledge, and all of that is just an immense amount of labor, because you have to survey and then like whittle it back down. But all of that comes from, how do I test this thing? And I'm needing to do that well and having limited other places to look, I think. Yeah. Thanks. I also have a question for you, as it happens. I was very taken with your comment about the way that noise trains a listener for kind of obvious purposes. I think it connects to this idea of kind of overwhelming information as well. The idea that noise trains a listener to kind of tune in and tune out. And so I wanted to ask, across the examples that you were looking at, but maybe particularly the more contemporary versions, how do you think that people are being trained to listen, but how do you think they're being trained to ignore or to tune out? Yeah. I think, as I said, I think there is a culturally specific dynamic to this. And of course, it's too complicated to unpack here, but I think in the case of Vietnamese noisy cities, it's a very particular artifact of us living through so much violence over the past 100 years. The French brought, the gramophone, and with that, a culture of radio listening that was much more communal than the one that we saw historically in the West. Radio listening in the West, as far as I'm concerned, is sort of an experience within the home. It's a domestic experience. In Vietnam, under French colonialism, by default, it was a communal experience. So during those times, if you were able to afford a radio set, it's a pretty big deal. It's a sign of cultural arrival. You want to show it off to the neighborhood. You want to angle it towards the window so that the entire neighborhood knows that, so-and-so recently got a radio set. So now we're all listening in to all these programs. And so I imagine during those times, people learn when to listen to the things that they care about, and when to tune out. Because your hand isn't on the actual buttons. You can't control what you hear within the collective environment, that is the neighborhood. You just learn to tune in and out. And that culture sort of made possible, more dramatic and more brutal things later on with the war on both sides of the Ben Hai River during the Vietnam War. And after the war ended, the propaganda broadcast didn't stop. It's still blaring today in Hanoi every day, and especially during COVID. During COVID, the propaganda broadcast was really brought back, and they were blaring every day, teaching people to wash hands and what to do and what not to do. So yeah, I think there's a historical cultural story there, and that sort of explains why Vietnamese people are so tolerant of noise, and why we love karaoke so much.
Okay, to close the loop, I'm going to pose a question to Fabian. Great talk, a lot there. Think about regenerative. I'm trying to understand, the concept of neural exchange value and sort of ground it more. And I'm wondering if you could tell us when, where, and how do you think neural exchange value emerged? The reason I'm asking that is because of something that you hinted at in your talk, which is the fact that, of course, semiotic exchange and middle ground has been in discursive and communicative techniques forever, but what you're looking at, you argue, is something specific. I mean, one could think that even discourse has actually a definition that comes from a latent space of everything that could be said, regardless of whether it is or not. What's specific about the when, where, and how of neural exchange value within that broader context?
Right. Thanks so much. I mean, this is not part, but it's like a little bit of a glimpse into the book project. And what we do there is about our history of where A, the concept of embedding emerged, and B, this is the part that you're asking about, where suddenly it became apparent that this is really kind of like the ideological turning point, right? Where suddenly people are making claims that these systems can not only model knowledge and regurgitate knowledge, but can produce new knowledge, that there's really new things to be found between the parts of the data set that have been embedded. And we could quite specifically point at some people. We could, for instance, point at, do this work in the book, we can point at Jeff Hinton's early work in the 1970s, his dissertation in particular, where he says, okay, we need this particular approach to so-called distributed representations, which is another word for exactly the technique I talked about. We need this to generate new knowledge. And the basis for this should be that we should regard it as a system of exchange. Actually, Hinton, in his 77 PhD, quotes Karl Marx and says, Marx says, we make commodities by making them exchangeable, by making them commensurable. Let's do the same for computer graphics. So that's a quote there. We can literally trace Hinton engaging with the theory of exchange and building a technical system on top of this theory of exchange, right? So there's a very clear historical linkage here. And there's more details that's very for now, but there's literally, you can point to specific things that particular people said that makes this interpretation, which is mine, of course, but makes interpretation somewhat substantial. Thanks.
Questions for Leo?
My question's for Dang. Firstly, an incredible presentation. Thank you so much. Drawing forward some of the thinking about the gramophone, about the communality of listening, about the work that speaking machines do in training the people they speak to, and thinking about smart speakers like Alexa or Google, and I won't say the wake word, so I won't trigger all your phones. How do you place them in this history? And what do you think they're training us to do?
Right. Oh, that's just a fantastic question. Because the gramophone in the home, we couldn't really speak to the gramophone. It was speaking to us. It was really one-way communication. Whereas with with Alexa and the like. It's really a conversation. It's built for conversation. And I'm thinking here of works by colleagues who have done a lot of studies on, this sort of human-computer, human interface, human-computer interaction. What are our voice assistants teaching us? I'm thinking here in particular of works done by people like Jenny Kennedy, who studied the gender dynamics of interacting with these devices in the home. And I'm sure this is familiar to the audience. What does it mean to have Alexa carrying a female voice versus voices that are not of that nature? What sort of values and kind of normative ideas are we bringing into these interactions? If we get angry at her and we try to get her to submit to our demands, what is that telling us about ourselves and the way that we interact with these technologies? So, which is entirely new. We probably can't say for sure, but probably we didn't think of the gramophone as gendered. Maybe we did with the floral and the sculptural aspect. Maybe the gramophone was a she. But maybe it would have been weirder then to speak to her and scream at her and demand her to submit. That's just some of the things that came to mind with that question. Such a great question. Thank you.
We might just ask people asking questions to give a short introduction. Just introduce yourself as well.
I'm Thomas Waite. I'm a PhD in media studies at the University of Melbourne, and I've got a question for you, Fabian, about the relation between commodity exchange and neural exchange. So Alfred Sonreffer, as we know, made an argument in the 70s about how the emergence of commodity exchange in the final millennium before Christ in Ionian Greece led to new forms of thought. Specifically abstract thought, which found its expression in the speculative philosophy of the Greeks. My question to you is, with the emergence of what you claim to be neural exchange value contemporaneously, do you see analogous possibility for new forms of thought? And if so, what specific content would they have?
Yeah, thank you. That's a fantastic question. And of course, the really big missing part here is a deeper investigation of the actual political economy that facilitates the emergence of these things, right? So that's partially work that we're also doing, but it's also work that other people like Matteo Leschinelli and many others have been doing to situate these systems with a wider, let's say, critique of the political economy. But it's really interesting. I'm thinking also of people like Idzik thinking about abstraction and things like that. But I think the relationship is the inverse. It's the other way around, right? Because it's the necessity for exchange comes from the idea that we want to have new forms of mechanized staking, so to speak, right? It is the fact that we want to have more knowledge than we put in, systemically speaking, right? That mandates us to produce the system of exchange. So in that sense, the system of exchange, neural exchange value, is a consequence of understanding these systems as systems that are capable to produce more than you put in, that manage to give you new insights, new knowledge, and so on. And if you take this a step further, right, there's, I think, something to be said to you also about the less often problematized uses of machine learning systems in the natural sciences, for instance, where exactly that is the main claim, right? Because we can look into the gaps between the representations that allows us to produce scientific knowledge to facilitate that discovery. But that, I would argue, is then also connected to this new system of exchange that emerges here. That makes sense.
Specifically, the structural condition.
Yeah.
You would flip that proposition and argue that it's a specifically infrastructural.
Yeah, you would say so. Yeah. Thank you.
Terrific. Have any other questions? Yeah.
Thanks. Randy Irwin from the University of Newcastle. This question is for Dang, but Kate, you might have something to speak to it as well. I was really interested in this idea that signal becomes noise in the ability to just kind of tune it out, or the struggle, therefore, to tune it out. And in your comment about COVID and coming back to the signaling, yet again, of like political authority and instruction, does the transformation of signal into this generalized noise create new possibilities for sort of undercutting of authority and creating sort of new fertile grounds for like resistance or subversion? And Kate, like to that point, does the struggle to push out noise turn parents into experts yet again, in that they know that that is noise and not what they want to do? Like, where does expertise and knowledge kind of play into signal as noise here? Thanks.
Yeah, what a wonderful question. And I hate to tell you that I was going to answer this in act number 3, but I didn't have time. So, yeah, if we had time, I was going to show stills from a really fantastic movie made by Fabian Offert about precisely that, about, you know, kind of this constant negotiation between the people and the government in living in this sort of sonic landscape. I think Vietnam made a lot of noise when it brought back the public loudspeaker system during COVID, because it's so easy to read that as the return of authoritarianism when it never went anywhere. So, you know, there's a sense in which it actually didn't return as much as it became louder. It was always in the background, and all of a sudden, it became the foreground, if that makes sense. So there are techniques of negotiation, as you can imagine, in everyday life. The people who install these public loudspeaker systems in neighborhoods, you know, they're friends with the people whose houses, you know, are being appropriated for these infrastructures. So if you know the guy who's coming to install a big loudspeaker in front of your house, you can say a few things to him, you know, turn down the volume a little bit, you know, maybe angle it to my neighbor rather than my house. So it's fascinating when you think about these infrastructures as enduring, but also as deeply human. On the ground, people are people. You know, people negotiate. People do each other favors. People, you know, find ways to live with each other and with infrastructures. So, yeah, I highly recommend the movie. I'll find a way to send the movie out. There's a public link where you can see that. But it really traces how all of these things are actually made livable on an everyday sort of scale.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that question. I'm always interested in thinking about the kind of avenues for resistance that might open up in different kinds of environments. And I think, I guess I'll premise this by saying this is still a research tangent and I haven't actually looked at this properly. But my hunch from the conversations that I've had with the parents that I have spoken to is that sometimes, yes, sometimes the experience of the noise is a prompt to turn away. Typically, that's something that happens over time from the few that I've spoken to, where it's been as you kind of grow in confidence. One participant actually talked about wanting to turn down the noise, that she kind of, you know, grew, felt more confident about what she was doing, and explicitly and very intentionally wanted to kind of tune out some of the noise. And that for her was a kind of, I guess, experience of kind of empowerment of feeling, you know, her own position as an expert in her child and her family and what she wanted for them. I think another consequence, though, is deferring to another kind of authority. So people would talk about, you know, that's too noisy. I'm just going to go and try and find this one other voice to listen to. And sometimes a push towards a real desire for like a simple answer. Because I am in this incredibly loud environment where everything's conflicting, like I just want one person to tell me one thing and I'm going to hold to that. And that's been a problem. I'd be very interested in that problem if we go back to how I first came to this, thinking about the conversation around children and technology. Part of the challenge in that is that there are some very kind of rigid universal guidelines. No screens under 2 an hour if they're under 5 and 2 if they're 5 and up over or whatever. And part of the challenge in trying to push back on those and say, actually, there's more nuance here. It depends on what's happening in your family. You're the expert in your family. Is that people don't want to hear that sometimes when they're like, no, just tell me how many minutes, how many minutes a day, and I'll go and try to do that. It also kind of closes down the space for nuanced conversation sometimes too. So there's an interesting kind of push and pull there, I think, that plays out differently in different situations. Thank you for the question.
So we're just about at time. Ranjodh hasn't had a question yet, so we might leave the last question for him, which I hope is going to work organically with your mic. But
cheers. Paul McGee, University of Canberra. Thanks, amazing panel. Fabian, and great provocation. In as much as an artist, or in as much as art proceeds from noise, it strikes me that it's a different type of noise each time. And often it's a type of noise that hasn't even been classified as noise, and the artwork reveals that it is noise. Aren't you just talking about one specific form of noise that possibly isn't even that noise hitting now that it's been formed?
That's very hard to answer. Obviously, right, again, in the context of the exhibition, this is a provocation because obviously I'm not talking about the artworks in the exhibition, which do something else and operate on an aesthetic plane that these systems do not claim to operate on. So in that sense, it's a bit more of perhaps a meta critique of how people attempt to critique and attempt to subvert artificial intelligence systems, or claim that could be subverted, by always pointing out that noise in general is the opposite, right, of the engineered signal, is the opposite of the classificatory system, of the ontologies of the system. And if we only could throw the noise at this, and if we want to take this a little bit into the artistic realm, right, the whole idea of adversarial examples and of, for instance, adversarial masks, right, you put some face paint on and that's enough to throw off the neural network. They always fall back, right, to this general idea that noise in itself, not in a particular form or appearance, noise in itself is already oppositional. And I think what I'm saying a little bit is that we might reconsider that a little bit. Not to say that, that invalidates artistic positions that explore that, right? Because they never only outright claim that noise is the opposition, but they do more complex things, obviously. Thanks.
I think we're at time. We might leave it there. Thank you, everybody. For those still curious about the Wi-Fi password, it is now in the program doc. So if you have access to data, you can get the program and then the Wi-Fi.
Yes.
And I think there's other logistics.
Oh, yeah, just that everyone's looking for the bathroom, which is over here. And there's one upstairs. And enjoy your tea. Thank you so much, Glenn, and the panel.
Thank you. We're back here at 12. Well, I don't know where. There you are.
Where are you done?
Where did it go?
Mhm.